Hi, everyone. Dr. Laurel and I are here today to just share a conversation and talk about our work that we do with families and parents and specifically student athletes, since we are both in the world of supporting families and kids to navigate their development up into adulthood. So stick around, and we can't wait to sort of get into the nitty gritty, but I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Laurel to introduce herself and kick us off with a conversation. So over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Laurel Mines. I'm a physical therapist. My practice is Bay Laurel Athletics, and I train and rehabilitate high school athletes and help coach mindset around sports. And I also work with parents and coach them on how to support their student athlete. Tell us a little bit more about your practice, Tara.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I also work with families, parents, and students, but on the ADHD side of their world. So families parents in particular, who are raising kids with ADHD often find themselves frustrated that traditional parenting strategies don't work, as the ADHD brain just demands something different from us as adults. And so I work with families to help them optimize their life and their approaches to raising kids that are designed specifically for the ADHD brain.
And what I find is, I'm working with a lot of families with student athletes, but they also have children with ADHD. So it's kind of nice to have, a collaborative network to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why this conversation is going to be great, because when Laurel was talking about what she does with helping student athletes, I was like, well, wait a minute, most of my kids are super active, right? They are out there in the world. Playing sports is such an important part of kids with ADHD. It keeps them active, it keeps them social, keeps them fit, all of those pieces. And yet, and Laura, you'll get into this more because it's amazing what you do. But the fear of like what happens with physical injury, or how do we manage all of the pieces, right? If they've got hours of sports after school and they're trying to be a good student, and all of those sort of complex parts.
Exactly. Our lives can be very dynamic and families can be very dynamic, which brings me to our first point that there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with, our kids, and there's nothing wrong with, you as a parent or how you're parenting. Um, a lot of people get coaches in, all ages and all areas of life. Sometimes, you get a coach for your kid to learn how to swim, or maybe you get a coach to play tennis or golf or whatever. Or there's also coaches in leadership and your workplaces and stuff. So it's really nice to have support, get support in the areas that you could that support would help you. um, and I just like everybody to, I'd like to invite everybody to kind of get out of the world of shoulds, like you should do this or you should do that, or it should be like this. And, all the advice that you're getting from society that it should be this way or that way.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely love that. And this is where we're totally aligned, right? I believe in my heart of hearts that coaching is one of the best things people can do for themselves and for their kids. And sometimes we think of traditional coaching as somebody who's like, it's only for a sport, or it's only for like massive achievement, right? This, like, if you want to be an elite, whatever, you have to get coaching. Whereas having somebody who is just guiding you through processes, helping you think about your thinking, helping you find your inner strength, helping you see the world differently, is so valuable. And that's what people at all these top levels do, whether it's, companies or athletes or wherever, right? I think everybody should have a coach, in the same way that, it's just part of your like general fitness. And then that next piece of like, there's nothing wrong, right? Like, sometimes we only bring in coaches or experts when we're trying to fix things, and we're trying to, we think there's something wrong because we're not living up to society shoulds, or we know that we have this feeling and comparing ourselves or our kids to other standards, and it just starts to fall apart. So I'm so glad you brought that up, that whole should piece. Like, should be a 4-letter word, right? Like, it should just be like out of our vocabulary in terms of the shame that it brings to all of us, right? When we feel like we should be doing something and then we're not.
And then you brought up a good point, like coaching is not just for the elite, right? I coach people, like I coach athletes even if they're just out to have some fun and learn some new skills. And not everyone that I coach and that I work with are going to go on to be, Olympic or collegiate or professional athletes.
Yeah. Do parents tend to get that? Do they, like, if you just had a regular, high school athlete, or I don't know, how young do you like to work with kids?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, the number one goal of young and adolescent sports should be that it's fun. It shouldn't not be fun for them. It shouldn't be grueling. I mean, not every single practice, every single minute isn't going to be fun per se, but overall it should be fun. So when kids are really young, it should really just be fun. So I'm not really working as strongly with elementary school kids. I mean, if they are injured in sports, yeah, I can help them, but it should really be fun. So I start to work with athletes more in middle school, in the upper middle school, 8th grade, especially in the transition between 8th and 9th grade is a great time for me to work with student athletes.
Yeah, my son was in that phase, and I noticed that there was a significant jump, right, in his physical expectations from his coaches, even sort of the demeanor, the length of practices, the intensity of the competition shifted in that, like, 8th grade year up into the now that he's in high school. But like 14U, almost rec league, like went this huge leap, and it was like, whoa, okay, like this is real all of a sudden. And I even remember that a little bit. I swam a lot as a kid. I was a USA swimmer, and like it gets intense. And I love the fact that you brought up that it should be fun, because when I look back on my swimming career, I'm not sure I was always having fun. There was a lot of like grinding things out, right? Like just grueling practices, and I didn't know any different. And I think the fun came from the camaraderie about all being miserable, which is kind of a sad state. Right? But that piece around having it be playful and fun. And I certainly know that in my work with kids who are enjoying being athletic, right? That's where they get some outlet, not only for their energy and their physicality, but they make friends and they connect with adults outside of their parents in terms of having mentors and leaders, and but only if they're enjoying it, right? If there's stress, like emotional stress and anxiety that comes up from having to go to practice, or such fear about performing in a game that, like, to the point where you don't want to play anymore, or you would rather just not get play time because if you miss the shot then your team's upset with you, or whatever it is, it changes that feel, right? That mental game I think you often talk about too.
Yeah, you're touching on a lot of things that I address in my programs, both from an athlete side and a parent side. And one of the biggest benefits is actually having more fun in the sports.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what age group do you typically work with?
So I work pretty much the whole range of elementary through high school, even into college. With parents, we notice that the symptoms around ADHD start to feel more stressful and more intense when school gets a little more intense. which can be sort of mid-elementary, second, third, fourth grade. For the most part, in the like K-2 world, people are still expecting kids to like wiggle their bodies a little bit. And there's quite a big gap in terms of what is considered like age appropriate learning. But something switches around second grade where all of a sudden it feels like kids are behind, or if they can't do things, or they need to sit and be still for longer periods of time. And so if a kid has an ADHD diagnosis, that tends to be where the first level of like comes in, because they're starting to get reports from their teachers. They're starting to become anxiety. The stress of school then translates to home. And all of a sudden they're looking at home and they're like, my kid just falls apart. Like they walk in the door at 3 o'clock and I have this just emotional kid who is screaming or crying or yelling or everything's a fight, who doesn't want to sit in their chair. And so the parent then is feeling all of that frustration because they want their calm kid. They want a nice evening routine. They want bath time to be lovely. And it's this like super tense space. And so that parents start to call me around that upper elementary all the way through high school, and for different reasons, right? And the reason my work is focused so much on parents is because when I work with kids, I only see them for like, anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, right? And we can put in some systems in place and I can really help them understand what's going on. But then I leave, right? Like we get off the Zoom call or like we leave the meeting, and to get those things to stick really takes the parent. And if the parent doesn't align with the things that I'm helping the child implement, then there's this total mismatch. And so what I found over time is that the most effective strategy is to really get parents in the right space, both from a mindset and like a strategy tool perspective, because they're the ones that are going to be doing the daily hour by hour support. And then they use me as this, like, this is working, this isn't working, what next piece to continue to like refine and tweak and level up their home life, especially as their kid changes, right? If you think about an 8-year-old compared to a 14-year-old, they're going to just need something different. And so, we work over time as their kid evolves to make sure that their home life and their parenting strategies evolve as well.
Yeah, what I hear you say is consistency. And that's a big part of what I do as well. So there's language and principles that I use with my student athletes, with the parents that I coach around the athletics, and with coaches and athletic directors, that everybody's speaking the same language and operating around the same principles. And like one principle might look different in different realms, but it still centers around the same principle. And actually, from an evolutionary biology standpoint, our brains are function much more with consistency. It dates back to the hunter-gatherer age, where when the food was more consistent, that meant we survived. So our brains kind of hung on to that consistency. So like in the family dynamic or in groups, if people are speaking the same language, operating under the same principles, it actually puts us at a much more calm, restful state where we're not fighting for our survival, because our brains really like consistency.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it fascinating that like all this stuff, we're this super complex beings, right? We live in this crazy complex world with technology and all these things, but when it really comes down to it, we're constantly managing like what center of our brain we're in. Like, are we in fight or flight, or are we in, the rest, relaxation, creative mode? And that the goal is to never not have, to only have one, right? But is to be in this balance and to recognize like, oh, here's what's happening and be aware. And then like, here's how I want to switch it. Because if you never get a little shot of adrenaline or a little excitement, right? Like, I don't know, I guess you just can't really stay in that rest zone all of the time. You need a little bit of the sympathetic nervous system to kick in, but we don't want to live there all the time as well. And it comes back to this like safety, right? Your brain being like, am I safe? Am I okay? Like, will I get fed? Are there resources? And so, I talk about this a lot with my families of like, if something's going on, look at their behavior, because the behavior is going to tell you how they're perceiving the situation. So
Mhm.
you might have the most loving home in the whole world, all the resources for you, right? Everything is there. You've never worried about food or shelter or anything. And yet your kid is having this like, I'm scared, right? I'm worried, I'm stressed, I'm fearful moment. And sometimes for us as adults, it's just hard to like wrap our heads around that, that's how they're feeling and that's how they're responding. And yet that's what their behavior and body's telling us. And so how we help them make that shift,
Yeah.
right?
And it just shows us like this is what it means to be a human being and let's manage that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure, I know with my kiddos when they're playing sports, like I want them to have a little bit of that adrenaline rush. Like that's the exciting part. That's part of the reason they feel it, right? Like they get pumped up to go play. They want to sort of have that quick energy, right? If they were doing, Zen meditation before the game, like it's not going to necessarily get them excited. Or is that wrong? Like, what's your take on that? Like, should they be in a more relaxed state before the game, or do you think they have some of that hyped energy?
So yeah, the hype and the energy, I find when it's empowering,
Okay.
that's when it's creates more possibility for success.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
when it's not empowering, depowering, um, then that's where it's not going to help you, right? So, even identifying what it looks like for each kid can be important. And what I find with a lot of my athletes is they're going into games and practice and training to prove other people wrong. And that's not really an empowering mindset to be in, playing the
Yeah.
sports. And I try to facilitate them to show up in the mindset that they're going to perform at their peak,
Mm,
not prove someone wrong, but perform at their peak. And that opens up much more possibility for a winning mentality. So identifying some of that and shaping some of that, like you were saying, is there is a strong driving force of empowerment
mhm.
and that adrenaline rush and that excitement um, without kind of negative, not empowering thought pattern processes. And the interesting thing is anxiety and excitement are like the same brain waves and the same physical processing in the body.
Huh, okay.
So sometimes you can switch or you can kind of facilitate turning the anxiety into excitement. And then you can identify when the excitement starts to turn into the anxiety. So there's ways to kind of I would say manipulate that pathway in a positive way,
Right.
um, turn the anxiety into excitement.
So that's like sounds like perspective switching, that like butterflies in the stomach doesn't have to be fearful, doesn't have to be anxiety, that could be excitement.
Yeah,
Or
so
thinking about what you're saying of like, oh my gosh, if I go out there and I'm horrible, then and I'm going to get kicked off the team or whatever, those butterflies aren't helpful. Like,
they're not as helpful. I mean, you can still have like you can still win with that,
right.
but you're going to be swimming upstream the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. That's why I love this work. It's so
Yeah.
cool, right? It's
Yeah.
so fun to see how we can help just from some real powerful like thinking shift
Mhm.
behavior, right? And then when we shift the behavior, we get totally different outcomes. And sometimes it doesn't take a lot. Like I know you do a lot of more healing work and actual like helping kids make sure that they are physically strong and not hurting themselves from a true like physiology standpoint. But it sounds like a lot of it's also this mental game, which it is for me too. Like I can give kids tools and systems, right, till the cows come home, but it's really the mental piece of, I want this to work. I understand why this works for me. I know when to use this tool. That makes all the difference in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. Should we get into the details now?
Yeah, tell me more about it.
Yeah. Okay. So when I work with student athletes and parents, when you take this one simple step, it only takes 60 minutes that most athletes overlook. You can set your child up to perform at their peak and prevent season-ending injuries. So what this is a preseason screening. Every child should go through a preseason screening before sports. I would say, like I said, later middle school through high school each year. And I know requirements at school are to take your kid to the doctor to get screened.
Yeah.
And that's just like the doctor sitting there looking at them sitting in their chair, checking their blood pressure, watching them bend over, see their gross movement, right? Which I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing. It's good to make sure their cardiovascular system working and there's no major medical problems, but it's just not adequate enough, right? So what I do is I do screenings at the beginning of the season, whatever season that they're entering in, and I look at 6 key areas. I look at flexibility, strength, endurance, stability, agility or coordination, and power. And a lot of people don't really look at power, don't know how to even screen it or look at it. So power is one of the things that is missing the most in kids' athletic ability to perform their sports well.
Yeah, even as you say that, are you talking power like how high they can jump? Like what does that mean?
Yeah, so more explosive force.
Okay.
So increasing force over a shorter period of time.
Got it.
Um, and it's not just about how high they can jump on both legs, but how do they perform on only one leg? And what muscles are, accountable for that? And are they compensating? Are they using
Right.
their physical abilities? Like I have a client now, 6'4", maybe, lacrosse. He's 17 years old. The coach told him he needs to gain weight, but he's not even strong and powerful at the body weight that he's at, which is going to build a gap. So if he just gains weight and he's not even able to support his body, that just makes the gap even bigger. And you can never perform at your peak unless you close the gap.
Yeah.
So
Fascinating, right? And you can see what the coach is trying to do of like, sort of that goes back to some of those shoulds, right? You should get bigger, you should have more muscles, you should whatever. Which can be well-intentioned but misguided, right?
yeah.
So having your sort of insight into like, well, hold on a second, before you go put on 20 pounds, let's make sure you know how to use the body you have right now.
Yeah, and put on the weight appropriately, which is a whole nother subject for a different day.
Yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that plagues a lot. I'm just going to say of our young men out there, my guess is it's with women as well. But I remember my time in schools, it was often the boys who were really focused on putting on muscle as fast as possible, right? Like doing extra reps in weight rooms and stuff like that. And now you're making me realize that it probably wasn't being done in a safe or effective manner, right? They were just doing whatever it took to sort of bulk up.
And I know with your kids that you work with, kids develop at their own rate. Kids and adolescents are going to gain weight
Yeah.
at their own rate, right? We don't need to force it. We can help support it in positive ways with good nutrition,
Mm.
exercise, but we don't ever want to force it. It's just not healthy to force that. And especially not with someone like this client that I'm telling you about that it isn't even strong enough in his own body. And then
Right.
just giving him more weight, then it's just a bigger gap of strength and power that he doesn't have. And then, like I said, he'll never be able to really perform at his peak.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's interesting you start there. I say when I start working with families, we do, I don't have something as tangible as like your physical assessment because it's on a different side, but it's still the first layer is always getting to know the individual, right? Like their strengths, their weaknesses, understanding what works, what doesn't. It's almost like that baseline recording because there isn't a one size fits all like approach, right? It's not just if you do these four things, then you'll immediately be somebody different, right? In fact, you don't want that.
Yeah, and that's why I do the screenings 1-to-1. It's a
Yeah.
whole hour with one kid, and it's individualized and it's sports specific. And so I kind of pick and choose the tests that I'm gonna choose depending on the sport that they're actually playing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then what do you do for parents? How do you help parents? Like, so I get this report back, then what? Then what
Yeah, so
happens?
that takes me to my next point. Um, So, there's a lot of schools that have athletic trainers, and some people are doing screenings, and some aren't, and some of the athletes get screenings and some don't. Um, but your student athlete can actually outperform every other athlete on the field and increase their odds of athletic success and do it without overtraining, risking injury, or relying on just their willpower alone. And what I mean by this is screenings without training or a home personal program to do is very pointless. We're not just going to screen people and say, this is your risk of injury. Hey, you're high risk, you're low risk, and not do anything about it, right?
Right.
So, actually training these athletes, I do trainings 1-to-1 with athletes. And for families that aren't interested in 1-to-1 training, there's many reasons for that. I do give them a home exercise program that
Mm.
they do on their own to work on their deficits. And I'm not saying that deficits are bad. It's just like every kid has them.
Well, of course, we all do, right? Like that's just becoming comfortable with understanding your own like ebb and flows and strengths and weaknesses and all that. There's such a negativity around deficit or weakness or area of improvement rather than like, well, of course, right? We all have those.
But yeah, I'm not just waiting for these kids to get injured. There's even other physical therapy clinics that are going out and screening kids, and then they just wait till they get injured and say, I'm here if they're injured. But, unless your kid's actually doing training, there's going to be a gap in
Yeah.
giving support to close that gap. And, some kids do it on their own. Some kids, I just give a home program and they do it and then they're good, right? Or they come back a month later and get another program to take
Okay.
their performance higher.
Yeah.
Some want that consistent training, and so I do that as well.
Well, there's that consistency word that we talked about at the beginning, right? And
Yeah.
that parents are part of that influence if they need to be, right? It's a little bit of accountability without force, right? Like a
Yeah.
parent can be like, hey, have you done this thing that we know is really good for you? And
Yeah.
that's certainly in my world too, right? So have you done the stretches or exercises that Dr. Laurel gave you? Or hey, have you done these things that Tara said in order to sort of level up your whole existence?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I have one more point before we get to,
Okay.
the real good stuff with the parents, but training this invisible muscle is what's preventing your child from reaching their peak performance,
Mm.
not just in sports, but also in their lives. And most athletes don't even know it exists. And the invisible muscle is your mind, your brain, your mindset, right? And so when we think about athletic success, I think of 5 key things. You really want the right equipment for the sport, and that's going to vary between sports. You want the equipment to fit right. um, the physical performance. Um, that's how their body's functioning. Like I said, those 6 key areas. You can also think about hydration, nutrition, rest and recovery under that. Then you have your skill and your strategy.
Okay.
And then you have your mindset, right?
Right.
So most people are pretty good about the equipment and the equipment fit, but that has to come first. But then quickly you can take that out of it, and then you have these 3 things left. Are they not performing well or as much as they could or at their peak or they're having injury because their physical performance, their skill level, or their mindset. Once you actually train their mindset, then they're aware of their mindset and they can identify if it's a mindset problem or not. Once you take that out, it either is the skill or the physical performance, and you can identify that and actually train it, or you can train more of the mindset if that needs to be done.
Right.
So it helps you to be very specific in what you're training these athletes instead of just shooting in the dark. And most people just overtrain the skill.
Yeah.
And they don't train the other things, and it's just more of the same with less of the benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so clear. And it's so true, right?
Yeah.
Like when things aren't working, we just double down, more skill, more practice, more skill, more skill, more skill. And it's like, that might not be the issue at all. Or maybe
But
they can't acquire more skill because we have to deal with these other things first. Like they're just not ready.
and when you train the mindset and you can identify it and take it out of the equation, it gives you really 2 things to work on,
Yeah.
right? And you can be so specific and you can get so much benefit in much less time and effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see that with my kiddos as well. More frameworks, more tools, more frameworks, more tools. And it's like, hold on a second. It may not be that, right? It's if the frameworks and tools aren't working, which is similar to your skill or performance piece, right? Like, let's go back and figure out what's really going on.
Yeah.
And that comes from, how they're feeling about things, what their perspective is on things, the self-talk, all of those pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so powerful.
And
Cool.
then the last piece that's
Yeah.
very powerful is the parent piece. Parents, you play a very pivotal role in your student athletes' lives, in your kids' lives, whether they're an athlete or not, on and off the field. And you must evolve beyond just their biggest supporter and loudest fan to becoming their best advocate and a different kind of coach. So when I work with athletes, I also work with parents and coach parents to help them support their athlete in ways that, their athlete's really going to thrive and succeed. I could just train or coach parents and their student athlete would change without even changing their student athlete. Like that's how much an effect that parents have on their kid. And I'm not saying like you're showing up wrong for your kid, but there's also like the consistency. When we restore consistency in your relationship with your kid is less in this fight or flight mode and in the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. So they're much more calm. If you can even show up more consistently. And what does that look like? And applying the principles that are important in your family.
Yeah.
There's so much power in just helping with that one area. I mean, I also coach parents in many different areas to help support their athlete and to also be able to communicate with their athlete and have this relationship with their teenager that's supportive, loving, open. Their teenagers are going to talk to them, tell them really up, all of that stuff. And then like athletics are just so much fun on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That relational piece between parent and kid is like, it's gold, right? And I think every parent knows that and feels it. And there's certainly no lack of effort or desire or want. Sometimes we just go about it in ineffective ways for our kiddo because we don't know any different, right? One of the things I noticed with my parents is they often mimic the way that they were raised, or they didn't like how they were parented. So they've sort of taken like the polar opposite, but it's still coming from their perspective rather than like, well, what does my kid need? Right? Like, how can I also shift to make sure that I'm showing up with with their needs in mind as well, and that we are really in this, like, we're in it together, right? This,
Mhm.
I use the word co-design a lot in my work, that like, how do we both get what we need out of this relationship, and and love and support and honesty and all of those things are at the core of it, that family values piece first. And then when there's something that's butting up against those values, right, when something happens, there's this like, we're going to rally together and we're going to figure this out, right? There's this like us against the dilemma, rather than
Mhm.
the dilemma being embodied by either one of us, or um kids feel bad, they don't want to like disappoint their parents, and the parents are like, well, I'm trying to do everything for you, right? And that just creates
Mhm.
this tension that doesn't have to be there.
So it's like the battle is, the family against the dilemma, not the family against the family.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
exactly.
agree, because I sometimes work with families that I never ever see the child, and the shifts that can happen in the home and in the relationships and in that life,
Mhm.
right, are astronomical,
Yeah.
because they're so integral in their kid's life.
Yeah, and so I help coach parents to help their student athlete be prepared and on time and accountable for it, and to clean it up when they're not accountable. And I can teach the parent to teach their kid that. And then you come up with this kid that's on time for their sports, and they're prepared, and they're trained well, and they're not overtrained, and they slept good, and they drink plenty of water without you nagging them, and like just taking the nagging out of it, um you know
Yeah.
just opening that communication where the teenager is like, hey, I want to talk to you, I want to tell you about this is what I've discovered, this is how I help myself. And having the teenager have an internal sense of themselves and making better health decisions for themselves, it's going to help them make better decisions in their own life. And
Yeah.
then the parent doesn't have to be chasing the teenager around helping them make good decisions, because I'm helping the parents and the teenagers um, for the to be able for the teenager to make better decisions about their health and their life.
Yeah, and I could even see it too. I don't know if this comes up in your world. It does in mine, where like sometimes the coach, for me, it's the teacher or another adult will say, "Hey, we want you to do this," and the child knows themselves so well that they have this moment of like, "I don't think that's going to serve me." And when they have a really good, open lines of communication with their parents, they can go back and sort of problem solve that together, right? So the
Yeah.
kid can come back and say, "My teacher wants me to do this, but I know that that's not how I learn, or that's going to trigger me, or whatever."
Mhm.
Then the kid can enlist the parents' help, because they feel safe enough to say, "I'm stuck in this situation and I need some help navigating it." And I guess it'd probably be the same when you have a coach who's telling them to do an exercise, which they know they don't, might re-aggravate their injury because they've worked with you. And so how do you help that kid respectfully say, "Oh, I'd like to do this one instead," or not
Yeah.
just do it because they're afraid of getting in trouble with their coach, or whatever it is. Like, these things are complex. But when
Yeah.
the kids and the
So
parents are talking, then they problem solve together.
yeah, and I help teenager to say, hey, this works for me, and this is why it works for me, and this is what it looks like, and communicate that really powerfully.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not like, "Oh, that doesn't work for me, this works," right? It's like,
Right.
"This works for me because of this, and I tried it out, and I feel it, and it works, and this is why it works, and this is what I'm communicating to you." And then there's a lot more respect from, parents and coaches, and they're like, "Oh, okay."
Okay.
Like, this child has really, like, figured it out.
Hmm.
And it's like, it's hard to argue when they figured it out, right?
Yeah. And when it's working, right?
Yeah.
When they're showing up and they're doing better and they've got a positive attitude and they're contributing to their team, and you can see progress, and both emotionally and physically and all of those things, they're not going to be like, "Well, whatever you're doing isn't working," right? They're going to be like, "Yeah, okay. You've got yourself figured out." Like,
And the coach and parent could be like, "Hey, can you try this?" And I also coach the kids around, like, if you try it, like, what happens and what's the outcome, and does it work or does it not work? And then how to communicate that, right?
yeah.
Like, not just them saying this works for me, but also being open to other things that could be working as well.
Yeah.
and then
Awesome.
trying it out, trying it on, see if it works, having that internal sense of themselves. And I mean, it helps when they go out in the world at college, right? But
Right.
the internal sense of what they know, what they don't know, how to figure out what they don't know, and how to make a decision that's really going to work for them, their lives, and not just in health, but just other, you know, areas of life, right? And I mean, that's such a powerful gift to give a student, a kid, an adolescent to make really strong, healthy decisions and
Hmm.
knowing and having the confidence in their decision. I mean, that's really
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
and I kind of think of it as time collapsing their maturity. A lot of people aren't learning these skills till their late 20s, 30s,
Yeah.
maybe their 40s, right? And I'm teaching these skills at a much younger age. My delivery is just through athletics.
Yeah. Well, I think what we're aligned with, I think, is putting this intention, right? So rather than just like hoping things work or not really knowing why, like, you know what feels good or what works, and you know what maybe doesn't, but you're not sure why. And so when you add this layer of intention and understanding behind it, then it's not just like shooting in the dark or hoping it'll work
Yeah.
again. You get this repeatable, consistent results. And when then something stops working, you're aware of it and you can be like, wait, this used to work, what's going on? And you know how to go back to your resources or go back to your coaches or whatever it is, or come back to you or come back to me and say, this worked up to here and now it's not working anymore. I'm not
Mhm.
sure what's changed. Can you help me figure it out? Because their
Yeah.
bodies change and their brains change and their circumstances change and all of those things happen. And that is a skill I certainly didn't learn
Yeah.
until I was like out on my own, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a methodology for it that gives them like a tool to use to go through the methodology just very clearly and concisely. And then, with that internal sense of self.
Yeah.
And really just having that internal sense of self is just going to help them get out from under all the pressures of society and the classroom and social media and all the pressures out there of their peers and whatever else. So, yeah, it's great.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else? Like, you've laid down some pretty big golden nuggets here for us.
Yeah, I would love to hear. Yeah, that's about all I have, but I'd love to hear more about how you help kids with ADHD and their parents and their families.
I sort of like sprinkled mine in through our conversation because I think it's very similar, right? What my focus is just looking around the neurodivergence element, right? Whereas yours is the athletic piece,
Yeah.
right? And so it's the same sort of things of making sure we've got the right structures and practices and mindsets and frameworks in place for both the child and the parent to make decisions that are in the best interest of the family and of the student, and pulling away some of the constructs. Like, school tends to be a really big one, or even sports in some respects, because it's this child comes in, they've got a lot of energy. If they have a hyperactive diagnosis, sometimes the coaches don't understand, their school teachers don't understand, and so it's, how do we communicate with them? How do we set the kid up for success? How do we get them to know what's going to work for them and not? Sort of navigating these big waters when your brain isn't wired like everybody else, and when compliance is a really big deal. And it's amazing, once you get out of, I would say, high school, even somewhat into college, we have this perception that like the world actually has a high compliance demand. And as young adults and even adults, it's not so true. Like, you can find jobs, you can curate your life in a way that really supports, your ADHD or however your brain works. But we can do so much damage in the K to 12 years that when they do get into college or when they go out in the world, they're not sure of who they are.
Yeah, and I could see, this diagnosis hanging over their
Yeah.
head that this is who I am. This is what's I'm limited to.
Yeah.
This is what my life is, and kind of coming out from under
Yeah.
the,
The
diagnosis,
label. Yeah.
yeah, the label, the
Mhm.
diagnosis over that, like, oh, well, you're ADHD, so you have limited possibilities for your life, right?
Right.
Like, just getting out from under that and seeing that there's so many more possibilities than our society really
Mhm.
gives us credit for, and not to limit those possibilities for these children.
Yeah, for any of them. And so it's that same sort of approach of like, what's, how do we, I call it, how do we develop this profound wisdom? And the wisdom is in all of the pieces of the metacognition and understanding who we are, that parent-child dynamic, right? From there, how do we as parents show up with a sense of presence? And that too taps into the same things you were talking about around making sure we really understand our family values, right? That we have an open and wide vision for our kids. So allowing that vision to be flexible. I mean, I work with one family who's now coming to the realization that like the traditional 4-year highly academic college may not be the path that their kid takes. And
Yeah.
like
A lot
that
of
was,
kids that don't take it, that don't have ADHD
yeah,
either.
but that was their thing. Like they were gonna, their kid is bright, and they were like, well, of course they're gonna go to college, and here are sort of the acceptable colleges, because that was just the way they were raised, and they hadn't really spent any time thinking about their paradigm in the context of their child, other than they were fearful that the behaviors they were seeing in high school were going to mean that they would fail in this college situation. And it was like, well, maybe in that college situation, but there's like 9,000 universities out there, colleges out there. Like there's a lot of other ways for your child to be successful. And let's not try to change your kid to fit the system, because it's just one system. We can give them tools to navigate the system, but like we don't want to dim their light, right? Because they're going to go out and do something incredible, and their brain is wired that way for a reason, and they're super creative and they're super active, and who knows what that's going to be. But we have to allow them to grow up enough to go explore those passions first.
Yeah.
And so there's a big mindset component in my world while we're practicing strategies and tools to deal with the immediate around things like getting out the door on time and behaving whatever that means, but in class, and learning how to navigate social situations. But the biggest piece of it is this mindset world. And when parents can shift their mindset and understand how mindset shifts, then they can help their child shift mindset. And so that they're not feeling like I'm not good enough, people always hate me, I'm stupid, or whatever it is, those messages that they're getting, sometimes very intentionally, sometimes more subtly, but they're getting them nonetheless, which we know are super damaging for long-term health. Right.
And I'm not a good parent, right?
And I'm not a good parent. Yeah.
And
none of it's true.
Yeah. And like getting out of like that right and wrong world, like, right? Like this is right and this is wrong. Like we have to kind of get out from under there and expand that. Like that 4-year college isn't necessarily right or wrong, right?
Nope.
Like, but it might work for one kid, but it might not work for the other kid. And something else that works for another kid, it isn't right or wrong. It just is different, right? Or
Right.
yeah. And then
And
also,
the whole package, like this one family realized their kid really wanted to go to college, but maybe they needed to live at home their first year. Like the thought of moving away into a dorm and like it was all too much. And the kid was even getting anxious, right? It was telling themselves, well, forget it, I don't want to go, I'll just go get a job. And when we really broke it apart, it was like, well, which piece feels actually somewhat manageable? And we even looked at them all individually. Like, are you ready to go live on your own? Right? Like, are you ready to hold a job? Like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I actually want to go to school. I want to go to college, but can I live at home for a little while until I feel like I've got the college thing figured out? And the parents were like, well, yeah, we just sort of like, we're in the mindset that you send your kid to college, right?
But even opening that conversation and being in the conversation,
Right.
even if it's a little uncomfortable or
Yeah.
more than a little uncomfortable, right? Just even
Yeah.
opening that conversation led you to this solution that just is so powerful for everyone, and
Yep.
not just helps the kid go to college, but helps them have a good relationship with his parents.
And the earlier you start this, similarly to you, right? The longer you have to build those lines of communication, you have longer to have you build that understanding of self. So when I start working with families and their kids are, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, by the time they get to high school, these aren't awkward conversations because they're so used to having the like, hey, what's out there? What's our options? Let's explore. That it just is like, it's natural. Like they don't even realize that it could have been a stress. But the nice part is it doesn't matter where you are, like enter into it. Even if your kid is out of the home, but you're struggling with your relationship with them, like enter into it because there's always a bridge, right?
Yeah.
In a way that you can support that.
And if you're trying to enter into that on your own and it's working, like get the support, right?
Get a coach, get the support. This idea that we have to do things all on our own is just such a misconception, I think.
Yeah. And I think you also mentioned that none of what I do or you do is like set in stone. This is the only way. Like it's very fluid, it changes. But it's, sometimes our track's not like completely linear and sometimes we take some turns and stuff, but it still gets us in the right place.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to be kind of like that, open to the fluidity of the process. But the fluidity is where the magic happens, right? Instead of being so rigid, like, even like I'm going to get a screening and we're going to get training, we're going to train the mindset and then the parents, and then this is how it's going to happen. Like things are going to come up, the training might shift, this might shift. I might try some things that don't work perfectly and then make another shift, but it's all just part of the dance,
Yeah. And it's all part of that progress, right? Sometimes I think we have to zoom out and recognize that like we're on this upward trajectory.
Yeah.
Even while there's like little dips and twirls, like you said, in between.
Yeah. And I didn't talk a lot about injury because that could be a whole nother topic, but injury can be definitely shift mindset with
Oh
these
yeah.
students. And that's a whole nother topic, not just a mindset around the sport, but a mindset around the injury. So that would just be another way. There would be like another layer of this stuff, but in a way that it's going to help the kid get back and not suffer from, the
Right.
mental hardship of the injury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's complex. Well, I'm sure we can talk. I mean, I know you and I have talked about this a lot. We could talk forever. So if people who are just learning about you want to get in touch with you, Laurel, where do they find you? How do they
Yeah, the best way to find me is at my website. The short version is bit.ly / A, capital P, capital T, lowercase WITH, capital D, lowercase r, capital L. I can put a link to that below the video.
Yeah, we can include all that. And on your website, it'll have information on how to get in touch with you or schedule a appointment or any of that stuff.
The phone number to reach me at, email address, way to schedule more information about my programs. Yeah.
Perfect. And if this is the first time you've heard from me, you can find me at dramafreeadhd.com. And that has all of my contact information and ways to get on my calendar and sort of an overview of what I do. And so you're welcome to join in there. And right now I have an offer for it's my 21 unsolicited parenting tips. And I know that there's 1,000 parenting tips out there. So I've always been reticent to give parenting tips. But over the years, these were my top 21. So if you're curious, they're free. You can just download them. And if you want to join in on a conversation, you can book straight on my calendar. So we'll make sure that those are linked appropriately so that people can get in touch with you and in touch with me.
Great. Well, Tara, thanks so much for the conversation today. This is great.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for all the work you do. And I'm sure we will be here again at some point in the future, maybe talking about injury. That would be fun.
Yeah, definitely. We could do a whole nother on that.
All
Yeah.
right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Laurel.
Thanks.